Hello, everyone, and welcome to what we in Maine's climate action community are calling the halftime show, analysis and commentary on the September meetings of the Maine Climate Council. We're calling it the halftime show because the Climate Council has done a lot of work already listening to Mainers and has a lot of work left to do to develop the final plan. We want to catch you up on what has happened so far and get you ready for the push to the end. Our goal today is to get you up to speed on what was said during the September 9th and September 16th virtual public Maine Climate Council meetings and provide some insight from our community on the climate action plan still in development and due on December 1st. First, on behalf of the organizations in our community, I wanted to express my excitement and gratitude that we get to have meetings like this. Thanks to Governor Janet Mills, Maine is one of the trailblazers of the climate change planning, and this year's climate action plan will likely serve as a model for other states working to develop action. We want to thank the governor and her staff at the Office of Policy Innovation and the Future, GoPIF, and all of the members of the Maine Climate Council and its working groups for their hard work so far. And honestly, what better time to be doing this than now? Despite all the challenges facing this state and the country right now, Maine's government has recognized the obvious. We can't delay responding to climate change. There is smoke in the air from the fires on the West Coast, for goodness sake. We know from polls that Mainers want to take action on climate change despite the challenges from the pandemic. And we're so pleased that the Maine Climate Council has continued to meet regularly, but virtually, and is still on track to produce a climate action plan by December. These are exciting times. The groundwork's being laid and the policies potentially implemented will benefit Maine, not just in the sense of improving our environment and our futures, but also putting Maine back at the center of innovation, positioning us to meet the economic challenges as well. But we'll only see those benefits if we can produce a bold and equitable plan. And we're here today to discuss what we think about whether we're on track. So before I get too far ahead of myself, I'm Nick Lund, the Outreach and Network Manager at Maine Audubon, and I'm joined by 4 distinguished panelists representing just a small sample of the organizations in Maine working to support a strong and equitable climate action plan. I want to introduce them now. With me on the Zoom is David Costello. He is the Climate and Clean Energy Director at the Natural Resources Council of Maine, NRCM. David worked for the state of Maryland, overseeing the development and implementation of Maryland's climate action plan between 2008 and 2015. So he knows about how these policies and procedures work. Also joined by Kathleen Neal, the Director of Policy and Partnerships at Maine Conservation Voters. Kathleen co-chaired the Buildings Working Group of the Maine Climate Council and serves on the Council's steering committee. Welcome, Kathleen. I'm also joined by Anya Wright, the youth representative on the Maine Climate Council and a founding member of Maine Youth for Climate Justice. Hi, Anya. And also by another Anya Fetcher, the State Director for Environment Maine. Welcome. Okay, so in a moment, we're going to start with a recap of the September meetings. But first, I wanted to take a moment to do a little bit of housekeeping here. And remind you, and then turn it over to Anya Fetcher to remind us how we got here in the council. So some housekeeping things. We have 1 hour to get through a whole lot of stuff. So we're going to try to keep things relatively short. We're going to save public questions for the very end. The way public questions are going to work is, you see here, we have 2 functions on this Zoom webinar. We have the chat function, which is that single speech bubble thing down below, and also the Q&A double speech bubble. In the chat, please type where you're coming from, other little things. If you have a question for the panelists, please type that in the Q&A box. That makes it much more easier for us to organize. So put your questions there. We're going to save them for the end. Secondly, this is being recorded thanks to Todd at NRCM. And so this will be available online afterwards. If you miss anything or want to share it, that would be great too. That's all. So, all right, let's get started. We're going to start now with a brief orientation of where we are in the process of the Maine Climate Council. And for that, I'm going to turn it over to Anya Fetcher from Environment Maine.
Great. Thanks so much, Nick. And thanks everyone for being here. As Nick said, I'm also really excited that we get to have these kinds of conversations. So I'm going to go ahead and just share my screen with everyone to get this going. I'll give you just a brief overview for those of you, especially who are less familiar with the Maine Climate Council, how they came to be and what they're supposed to be doing. So on June 26th of 2019, the governor and the legislature created the Maine Climate Council. It's an assembly of scientists, industry leaders, bipartisan local and state officials, and engaged citizens. So that was about 1.25 years ago. The Climate Council is charged with developing strategies to both reduce Maine's greenhouse gas emissions and to ensure Maine's people, economy, and communities are more resilient to the impacts of climate change. You can see here they have these guiding principles that they are referring back to as they continue their work. More specifically, the council is tasked with developing a 4-year plan to put Maine on a trajectory to reduce emissions by 45% by the year 2030 and by at least 80% by the year 2050. By executive order of Governor Mills, the state must also achieve carbon neutrality by the year 2045. The way that the Maine Climate Council is set up is there is the Climate Council itself, but they're also supported by a number of subcommittees and working groups. So the working groups are made up by a total of about 250 members, and they were created to inform the Maine Climate Council and recommend strategies for the climate action plan. So each working group spent months developing its climate mitigation and adaptation strategies, which were presented to the council this past June. The working groups are buildings, infrastructure and housing, coastal and marine, community resilience planning, public health and emergency management, that one's a mouthful, energy, transportation, and natural and working lands. In addition to those 6 working groups, there is also a scientific and technical subcommittee, which provides the latest information on direct and indirect effects of climate change, along with factors contributing to those effects in the state to the Maine Climate Council's working groups. And this has helped inform their research and consideration of mitigation, adaptation, and resilience strategies. The 369-page report that they just released, it goes into great detail, of course, on the way climate change will affect Maine, and it is available on the Maine Climate Council website. We'll also share that in the chat with you in a bit later. And then last, just a brief timeline of how this is all working and where we are now. So technically, the first Climate Council meeting was actually last September, just about 1 year ago, launched their first quarterly meeting. And since then, working groups have been meeting to talk about and propose solutions. And then in January, the Climate Council met again to really start this process and start digging in. In February, the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee released their first draft phase 1 of the climate change and its effect on Maine report. And then this past summer, as I said, in June, the Maine Climate Council working groups, they presented their draft strategies to the Maine Climate Council. Following that, and throughout the rest of the summer, the Maine Climate Council considered these draft strategies, in addition to receiving the cost of doing nothing and cost benefit analysis reports from External Analysis, Eastern Research Group, and Synapse. And they also gathered public input on the draft strategies in the form of public surveys, which I believe that many of you filled out, which has been incredibly important. We had, I believe, 4,400 or so responses. And this fall, that's where we are now, in case you lost track of time. We are in the September. So the Maine Climate Council is currently refining and selecting final strategies. and preparing for the state climate action plan. So originally there were going to be 2 meetings. Now, because we're doing things over Zoom, there are 5 meetings planned. We just wrapped up number 2 yesterday. There will be 2 more in October and 1 more in November. And then in December of this year, the 4-year state climate action plan is due to the governor and legislature, and they will consider and decide any legislative and rulemaking actions to enact in law. And then just going forward, that is not the end of the line when they deliver the plan. As after it's submitted, the Climate Council will continue to meet quarterly. Working groups will meet at least twice a year to monitor the progress. The Maine Department of Environmental Protection will report on greenhouse gas emissions every other year, and the Climate Action Plan updates every 4 years. So this plan is intended to shift and change as we learn more about the science and as technology advances. In addition, ideally, our climate community feels that we really hope that things end up moving even faster and the policies are more aggressive than these original goals. So that's just a bit about the Maine Climate Council and what they're at, and I'll turn it back over to Nick.
Great, thank you, Anya, for that overview. That was fantastic. I'm gonna touch on a little bit more the meetings that the Climate Council just had in terms of an overview. So we are coming at you a day and a week after the Climate Council held 2 meetings, one on the September 9th and one on September 16th. And I just want to cover what was said a little bit more there before we dive into the discussion. But actually, we want to take a pause for a poll question really quickly. So Todd, if you could load that up. We want to ask for the folks who are on this call, did you attend or Zoom in rather to those meetings, the September 9th and September 16th meetings? It would be great to get a sense of where the audience is coming from and how they're doing. So if you could take a moment, please, and I see that popped up. Thanks, Todd. That would be great. So while I give you time there, that's a quick one. So about half and half, about 60-40 weren't in attendance. That's good to know in the great mix of folks. Thank you for filling that out. So Anya, if you could share the first of my slides, please. So the goal of these 2 meetings in September was for the Climate Council to discuss the draft of its proposed climate strategy framework. There we go. So this is going to set the stage for the more detailed policy discussions to come over the coming months. The council divided their climate strategy framework into 2 parts that you can see here. Part 1 was discussed at the September 9th meeting. Part 2 was discussed yesterday at the 16th. And you see, so part 1, we're thinking about strategies to reduce Maine's carbon emissions. And strategy 2, or part 2 rather, were strategies to prepare for the impacts of climate change. Under each part of the framework, there were 3 strategies. The proposed areas under the first part, as you can see, and I'm just sort of reading off the slide, but I do want to make sure that we are on the same page about what they're talking about. When we're coming to reducing Maine's carbon emissions, number 1, we're talking about bringing the future of transportation to Maine. Number 2, modernizing Maine's buildings. Number 3, driving innovation to reduce carbon emissions in Maine's energy and industrial sectors. Again, this was what was discussed at September 9th. The 3 strategies under the second part, strategies to prepare for the impacts, are number 1, build healthy and resilient communities. Number 2, invest in climate-ready infrastructure. And number 3, protect Maine's environments and natural resource economies and promote climate change solutions. These were what was discussed at yesterday's meetings. Folded into the draft proposed climate strategy framework were 2 important reports that have been touched on a little bit already. Number 1 were the results of public surveys that Anya mentioned. These were brought out to the public in July and August, pushed out by a number of groups. We got a great response out of that. Over 4,400 Mainers from more than 150 towns filled out these surveys, which focused on the particular recommendations of each working group. And we'll talk a little bit more about what those surveys revealed in a moment. Secondly, there was a cost-benefit analysis conducted by the Eastern Research Group and Synapse Energy Economics, which analyzed the vulnerability of the state of Maine to future impacts from climate change. It analyzed the cost of doing nothing, or as someone mentioned, the cost of doing nothing different in response to climate change in the state. There was also an emissions analysis of draft greenhouse gas reductions from various strategies proposed by the working groups, and an economic analysis of the draft emissions and adaptation-related strategies proposed by the working groups. We'll be talking also about that more in a moment. And we're going to turn now, we're right on time, I think, to some discussion about what happened at the two meetings and those reports. So all my panelists off mute, please. We are getting started. Here we go. So we're going to start with some discussion through these panelists. This is going to be a really interesting sort of back and forth, we're hoping. And we're going to start, I think, with these public surveys. So there was a big push for the public to complete surveys about their climate concerns over the summer. And as we said, more than 4,400 Mainers were completed, and the findings were folded into these policy discussions. On your right, I'm wondering if I could start with you to share your thoughts on these surveys and what the responses showed. And actually, before you say that, I do want to say that thanks to Anya Fetcher for putting a link to a summary of these public surveys in the chat there. So Anya.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. And thanks to Anya F for putting that link in the chat. Definitely worth taking a look at. But yeah, as Nick mentioned, there were 4,400 or 4,400 responses to these surveys that were put out for public comment on the working group recommendations. And they came from 150 Maine towns, which represents about 74% of all Maine zip codes, which is impressive given the fact that we're in a global pandemic and that originally public input was going to be gathered through a lot of in-person meetings that then went virtual. So definitely impressive how many people were able to respond. And I think as a Climate Council member, this public comment is really important to me to make sure that we're really reflecting what people in Maine are concerned about and what priorities we should be looking at. And I would add to that, though the surveys are closed, the Climate Council is still receiving public comment until September 24th, which I know we'll talk a little bit more at the end. Thanks.
Great. Does anyone want to talk a little bit about sort of how those surveys were set up and maybe what they revealed once the final summary came out?
Yeah, I can add a little bit there. Thanks, Nick, for the question, and Anya for setting that up, and for all of you for being with us today. The responses to those surveys were overwhelmingly positive. The way they were set up was by each working group, and there was basically a list of the strategies that the working group had proposed, and an opportunity to indicate whether those felt like a great fit, a good fit, or not such a good fit for each individual in their community. And what we saw is that really the more people know about the particular strategies, the better they feel about them. The buildings working group, for example, led off with a recommendation about weatherizing existing homes, and that was incredibly popular. More than 86% of respondents said, this is a great fit for my community. And I think that really reflects how much work we've done as a state to get that weatherization and energy efficiency ball rolling already. And it gives us a lot to be optimistic about, that as we spread the word and the access to more of those climate action strategies, we'll see really good responses to those as well. I also think it's worth noting that those positive responses came at a time when we're all very aware of the other challenges that our state faces, right? The climate crisis is not the only overwhelming crisis that we're working through, right? We have a public health crisis, an economic crisis, a racial justice crisis, and people are still saying, yeah, and it's important to act on climate right now.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think too, that point is underlined. One of the survey results asked folks, which aspects of the community are you most concerned will be harmed by climate change? And the top 4 answers were: number 1, public health; number 2, wetlands and coastlines; number 3, wildlife; and number 4, Maine's economy. All of which were, are extremely important in people's minds and represent sort of a broad, I think, swath of concerns, from personal health to the economy to environmental concerns. So I think that was interesting. Any other?
Nick, yeah, Nick, hi, good afternoon to everyone. I would just add as well as the public surveys beyond this, public polling has actually been very positive for climate action. Overwhelming numbers of Mainers support doing a lot more to address, the causes and consequences of climate change. So I'd just add that as well.
That's great to note. David, I'm going to continue with you for about the cost-benefit analysis. What were your thoughts about that report, and was there anything missing?
Well, a couple of things, Nick. Just to give a shout out as well to the Science and Technical Subcommittee. They've done a superb job with their assessment of climate impacts and effects in Maine. Tremendous job. ERG's recent work, the cost of doing nothing that you just mentioned, for instance. The key takeaway there is that not doing any more would likely lead to at least a 15% decline in economic output and a loss of over 20,000 jobs in Maine by 2050. So obviously we need to do more, and we want to do more, and that's what we're talking about today. The cost-benefit analysis itself, and this is something that will continue as the climate plan itself continues, and the climate actions are undertaken. It did a good job, and Kathleen's going to start off and talk about some of these more specifically in a minute, but they did a great job of identifying the most cost-effective programs, particularly from a cost savings perspective. However, they didn't do enough or much, notably, for instance, regarding some key strategies. And what I would note is there was nothing done from a cost-benefit perspective on the funding mechanisms that are going to be needed to drive progress. So that's something that obviously the Climate Council and the state will need to focus on more going forward. And also, there wasn't much said about potential jobs. Clearly, as we enact and make the kinds of investments we'll be making in the coming years to really build a stronger, healthier, more resilient and prosperous Maine, we're going to be investing a lot of money. And this money is going to turn into thousands and thousands of jobs, whether they're adaptation jobs or jobs related to energy efficiency, economic energy, renewable energy deployment and development, building out doubling the size of our electric grid, for instance, to accommodate the beneficial electrification. And just so people know, we're sending over $5 billion out of state, $5 billion for energy to address energy costs in Maine. Much of that can be brought back to Maine and will be brought back to Maine in the coming years. So again, tremendous economic output. And when we talk about jobs, high quality jobs if we do it right. So I think, again, as regarding cost benefit analysis going forward, we'll look more at the attributes particularly the specific key actions that the state does enact when it refines its plan and provides better detail. And of course, the state's already said that they need to do more to prioritize and sequence the actions. And as they do that, obviously we'll be looking for implementation targets that'll be easier to provide analysis on, as well as benchmarks and maybe even biennial benchmarks to go along with the state budget process. So those are the kinds of things I think we'll be looking at as the cost benefit analysis continues. And let me just stop there, Nick.
That's a great answer. Thanks, David. And just to sort of underline that point, there's a lot of optimism right now around this in a world where there's not much optimism in any other facet. That a strong plan here can help us not just out of environmental hole, but really position us economically in a great place. And so I think that cost benefit analysis revealed that, and additional thinking there will emphasize that. to Kathleen, are there strategies, which of the strategies here that you see, maybe overall, had the greatest greenhouse gas reduction potential, according to some of the analysis I've done so far?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And the analysis that came out of ERG and Synapse was super helpful in thinking about how these strategies compare to each other. There's a slide that I think will help us. Fabulous, thank you, Anya. So what you see here is over on the left, a list of the strategies ranked by their greenhouse gas reduction or sequestration potential. And then you see how the ones at the very top are the most cost effective. Important to note that this is not a competition. We're not looking for the one strategy that will solve all of our climate problems. We're going to need to enact a whole host of strategies to reduce our emissions, to sequester carbon, and to address the climate impacts. But it is really helpful to sort of sort them, sort the possibilities to see what's a good place to start. I think this work will be really helpful as the council thinks about sequencing strategies. And you can see that a number of the strategies that revolve around buildings are not just cost effective, they're cost saving. Anybody who has drawn on efficiency Maine programs to weatherize your home or to put in a heat pump, you know this. You know that when you invest in tightening up and weatherizing homes, you get more comfortable, you get an energy savings immediately. That's a great way for us to think about messaging these potential strategies for the public, right? To say, this is something that is a no-brainer. There are no regrets to investing in these strategies. As we move down that scale and get it slightly less cost-effective, but still really cost-effective, we think about EVs. Electric vehicles have a slightly higher price point at this point, but we know from auto manufacturers that is the way the industry is moving. And the commissioner of the Department of Transportation, Bruce Van Noot, described this sort of future vision where there is a used EV and a hybrid pickup in every driveway in the state. And when we think about that, we think about how much those cars are going to save us money. No more oil changes, no more maintenance. You got to rotate your tires, but that's about it. So there is a future where this really is saving Mainers money and time and energy, and also meeting our climate goals at the same time. So this kind of analysis is really helpful.
Great. Thank you so much. Any other thoughts on the energy saving piece? If not, I can move on to sort of a broader overarching question, which is, as we think of these overall, and we think about the world of policies that are sort of on the table here that can help us get to our climate goals, can we have a sort of a broader discussion about what some of the impacts of some of these policies and consideration would be like for Mainers? Anya, maybe I could start with you.
Sure, thanks, Nick. Yeah, so I think it's worth noting that the statute that we have now in Maine is one of the boldest in the country, and there's a real opportunity for Maine to be a leader. And so I think that's one big opportunity here. Also, of course, the sense of urgency that my generation and future generations have. There is definitely a level of needing to get things done, but also there's a lot of social and economic and obviously environmental opportunities with this next climate plan. And one of those being encouraging more climate justice and climate focused education within our public schools. As we sit now, folks within my coalition of young people are struggling with finding access to climate education within their schools. It's not a part of the general curriculum at the moment. So that's a real opportunity to create a really strong, resilient next generation of folks who are very educated about the issues that we're facing right now. And maybe I'll pass it along to someone else to talk about another policy.
Sure. Let me jump in, Anya. Thanks. One thing I'd like to highlight in terms is just the challenges as well, and the key strategies that are likely to address those challenges best, and in doing so, really drive the benefits that we've all talked about in terms of the economic benefits, the environmental benefits. These are the strategies that, quite frankly, we believe, or at least many of us believe, will deliver the greatest results. And in the two challenging areas, transportation, the greenhouse gas reduction challenge, you've got the transportation sector and the building sector. That's 80% of Maine's emissions. So what we do there is some of the things that Kathleen's already started to talk about are important. The elephant in the room, the other challenge is financing. And of course, it's tough, but we've got to address these. So the strategies that we think, or at least certainly I believe, will do the best in delivering the broadest, most significant benefits, again, helping to build, Maine to build that stronger, healthier, more resilient and prosperous future for all Mainers, and certainly addressing Mainers who are living in underserved communities, for instance, and low and moderate income households. On the transportation side, I think it's critical that Maine sign on to the Transportation Climate Initiative. It's a regional cap and invest program that's been discussed since 2009. It's similar to those who are familiar with the RGGI program, where what you try to do is you put a cap on the regional emissions tied, in this instance, to motor vehicle fuels, and you tighten that cap over time. And in doing so, you get the polluters to pay to emit. They buy allowances. That money, it could be up to $150 million a year for Maine, would then go into what we call transportation solutions, as Kathleen started to talk about, EV deployment. We think electrifying transportation is going to be the best way to reduce those 54% of emissions in Maine and help us reach our goal. And of course, also what it'll do on the transportation side, it'll fund solutions. And again, you can design it in a way that much of that money goes to rural communities or other communities that are disproportionately impacted. So it'll help to build out public transportation, for instance, expand public transportation services in Maine much more equitably, and just expand them as well. Help with better land use planning, compact, smarter growth, for instance, and development, allowing more walkable, livable communities. And as Kathleen said earlier, the expansion of the EV deployment. The other thing I would mention on the financing side, because that's a real tough nut to crack, it's going to be important for the state to have a detailed action plan, regardless of whether or not the money is there. We need to meet what science requires in our implementation targets. But at the same time, we can be honest and realistic about the challenges. And financing is a big, big challenge, particularly given the economic downturn and the COVID crisis. So what we could do here now, some of the money I mentioned will be raised by TCI. The other thing that's interesting, I mean, Maine can continue to bond, which it may do, but also if we were to establish a clean energy and climate resilience bank, expanding the concept of a green bank that's been utilized in other states, most notably in Connecticut, and having that bank leverage private capital to undertake an expansion of our renewable energy projects, our energy efficiency projects, and also allow it to even deal with adaptation. There are going to be a lot of projects on improving our waterfront, dealing with flood controls and stormwater controls. A lot of jobs will be generated in the coming years as we adapt and prepare for climate change, which we all recognize now. And this bank is an idea. Other opportunities for funding, of course, the federal government's going to have to step up in a big way. And Maine raising more revenue, having more revenue, will allow the federal government allow us to get more match, because many of the federal dollars are tied to a state or local government match. So again, that's something. Also, there are lawsuits that are afoot to require polluters to pay more, like the tobacco settlement years ago or the recent Volkswagen settlement that could bring more money into Maine. So these are the kinds of things. And I know that many in Maine are looking at financing, being creative about financing. We want multi-state, we want even national conceivably mechanisms to help fund And no state, quite frankly, is going to meet what science requires in the coming years without the federal government stepping up in a big, big way. And there are carbon pricing. The economists will tell you that a better carbon pricing initiative than, say, TCI or RGGI is needed, and we need that at the national level. So these are the kinds of things I think the council will be taking a look at, and certainly that Maine and other states are looking at going forward.
Awesome. Thanks, David. And I want to keep this discussion going. A couple reminders, helpful reminders from some folks listening in to be careful of our use of acronyms. This is something that is very helpful to have a check on. I appreciate that. And
You're
we had a question.
terrible at that. I feel like
it's
the
so
environmental community is one of the worst offenders. So please, please, please call us out when we slip.
It's so hard. And there was a question, actually, Dave, if you could do it in a sentence or two to explain what TCI stood for and was.
It's the Transportation Climate Initiative. It's a multi-state Northeast regional initiative, again, that would establish a cap and invest program, put a tightening cap on emissions tied to motor vehicle sales in the region that would tighten over time, that would thereby reduce emissions, and also would require the purchase of allowances that would raise revenue for all of these wonderful transportation solutions that the Climate Council is taking a look at and has already surfaced in its excellent work put together by the working groups.
Right.
And just one more piece about the Transportation Climate Initiative, because it feels like a lot to wrap your head around. The most important thing to know about it is that it's based on the same model that we have used very successfully to reduce emissions from power plants. So from the electric generating sector, that's what's called the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI. And it's been incredibly powerful over the last decade or so. A group of the Northeast states coming together to say, we cannot let our power plants continue to pollute and wreck our air quality. We're going to tighten up the cap, make them pay to emit, to pollute essentially, and then use the revenue. And here in Maine, the revenue from that Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative program is largely funding Efficiency Maine. So you can sort of see that model of taking a polluting sector, cleaning it up, and at the same time generating money to keep cleaning it, reduce the need for it. We need less electricity as we get more efficient in the way we use it. We will need less gasoline as we switch to electric vehicles. And so it's a win-win.
Great. Back on this question again of, what are the impacts of some of these policies under consideration to Mainers? Kathleen and Anya, do you have other things to add there?
Sure, I'll just add something on the topic of land conservation. At the moment, we're losing about 10,000 acres a year to development. So there's a lot of work to be done to have more land conservation initiatives. And there's a need to support hundreds of natural resource jobs, protect thousands of acres of Maine's forest. Maine's forests are a huge carbon sink within the state, so they're really important to protect. And then there's also a need to support ecologically significant land and address conservation investment shortfalls. And one way to do this is creating a dedicated, sustained public funding source that generates at least $15 million a year annually to conserve working forest, agricultural, and ecologically significant lands. And if any of the other panelists want to comment on that too, I welcome it.
I'll just say, if you have taken a walk in the woods or along the ocean in this this crazy time that we've been living in, you know just how much we need to conserve our lands so that we have them available, not just for their environmental and climate benefits, but for our sort of mental health and emotional health and who we are.
And one thing, a couple of things I would add as well is, we're talking about sustainable agriculture and forestry as well. Regenerative agriculture is something that we can do a lot more of in Maine. It'll be good for the environment. Obviously, it's good for food system and food security in state. as well as when we look at the forest products industry. I mean, Maine's always made a tremendous amount of money from forestry. It can make more by sequestering, and particularly if we develop any regional or national markets for carbon sequestration, which I think will come in future, as well as if we manage the forest properly, we can expand the carbon stocking of a forest, the ability for the forest to take in, the forest soils to take in more carbon, but also we can generate more jobs by also including embodied carbon and mass timber, and also wood fiber products, wood fiber insulation. And even if we get to the point where we've got advanced biofuels for some of the waste wood, that is truly renewable. And a lot of jobs, a lot of, again, more money for the state in future.
Great, thanks everyone here. I want to jump now, as I previewed in the chat a little bit, to what happens next, right? So if we could, what's going to happen now moving forward? And then, really importantly, how do we, the council, the people of Maine who care about this, how do we get public buy-in and support for some of these things as we move to legislation or other pieces? Kathleen, I wonder if you could start.
Yeah, it's a great question. And this is where we put a big asterisk next to our title for today's program, The Halftime Show. It's like the halftime show of game one of a very long series. What we have in front of us right now is a framework. And the Climate Council has sort of 24 big ideas that came out of all of those recommendations that the working groups presented. It's a great start. There are a lot of really good ideas on the table. But the next step, the next immediate step, is to turn those big ideas into concrete actions and to really pull them together into an ambitious climate action plan that meets our statutory emissions reduction requirements, that addresses our equity concerns, that really plans ahead and starts to grapple with some of the questions of how we're going to fund this. The cost of doing nothing different analysis demonstrates that we're going to pay for this one way or the other. We can pay for climate change in a really reactive sort of crisis management kind of way, or we can be thoughtful and proactive and say, let's make wise decisions about how we invest. That's the immediate next step. Just that one, easy to check off, right? But even once we get that climate action plan in front of us, and it is due to the legislature on December 1st, the legislature will need to accept the plan, and then we expect some legislative proposals to flow from there. There may be lawmakers who see an element of the plan and say, we're gonna propose this piece of legislation to put that into place immediately. Those kinds of proposals will be grappled with in the relevant committees in the legislature, and it's really important for all of us to show up to support that process, to build a bipartisan, really broad sort of momentum to act on the climate action plan. Plans are great when we carry them out. And David, I think you have some more specifics about, what does it look like to carry out this plan?
Sure, let me touch on that a little bit more in terms of implementation, because it really is about who's assigned to carry out the actions that Kathleen has just talked about. And it's really state agencies, but state agencies working with the private sector and stakeholders. And that's why it's important at some stage that these actions, particularly the key programs, the agencies develop work plans that can be measured, that can be tracked, that can be routinely reported on. And of course, the science and technical work group will continue to take a look at all of this. I think, you're going to need ongoing cost benefit analysis. And you're certainly going to need, the council in its work to continue to look at the progress. So that's why if the state does establish work plans, agency work plans related to not every action, but certainly the key actions, and that they measure them routinely, report on them, report to the council, allow the council to weigh in, in its quarterly meetings, and certainly report to the legislature and the public. I think that'll help to drive, not only will it help us to measure progress, it'll help us to drive progress as it relates to all these important programs and policies, and as well as the goals, and make adjustments as we need to going forward.
Thanks, David. So I'm watching the clock. Now we know why the Climate Council took 6 hours over 2 days to get through this. We want to move on. We have a lot of great questions we see coming up already, so we're going to try to move quick here. I'm going to end with one final question to each of the panelists, and then we're going to talk about very quickly some action items and then move into the questions. So that final question is, there's a lot of excitement in the air around this plan. I want to know from you, what are you most excited about for this plan and the process so far, and why should Mainers be excited about it? Who wants to start?
I'll start.
Go for it, Anya.
Clearly, there's a lot of reasons why we're all excited. Yeah, I mean, I think this is just a huge, huge opportunity for the state to really be a leader and to really get some concrete work done. Again, Kathleen was mentioning that we have a plan, but then we need to get it done. And I'm excited for the work moving forward to really implement some of these great policies, and also to continue adding some policies to the current plan. As mentioned, the plan as it is now is a framework, so there's still time to add more to it, and there's definitely some holes that I see and that I've heard about within the plan that feel really important to get within the plan, so I feel excited about that.
I'm really excited about the opportunity that we have to meet a whole lot of our state's goals. The climate urgency that we all feel is clearly top of mind and what's driving this process. But at the same time, we have the ability to make our state a more equitable place and a more inclusive place, to build out the economy of the future, to be really proactive in developing the kind of strong communities that we care about and that we really want to see. Sometimes talking about the climate crisis can be overwhelming and frankly a bummer, but this plan is really exciting because of all of the things it lets us do and grapple with together.
And Nick, I would just add, I'm just excited. Well, I'm very excited about being back in Maine, where so many people are engaged in climate action. Compared to Maryland, unfortunately, Maryland is not making the level of progress. It's exciting that we've got a governor who's really committed to making a big difference, as well as many in the legislature and local officials. But the fact that over 250 people have participated in the climate action planning process through the council and working groups is just tremendous. And that's very exciting. The other thing is, I think Maine is well on the way to not only being a leader, but to being a carbon negative state. I mean, I think what you'll do, Anya Fetcher talked about more aggressive goals. I think, quite frankly, we won't be only carbon neutral by 2045. Maine could be carbon negative. It can be a drawdown state. To really address climate change, we're going to have to draw carbon from the atmosphere. It's already there, and we're going to have to draw it down. And Maine can be a real leader, and I think we will, particularly if we just keep putting pressing forward and as we have thus far, at least the last couple of years.
Yeah, that's the kind of excitement I'm talking about. I love it. Let's end right there with these questions. Thank you so much to the panelists here for all your insight. That was great. I want to move quickly now because we have a lot of questions to get to. Before we get to them, I want to talk about a few action items. Anya, if you could please share the slide. Just a few things you can do if you're as fired up as we are. The first is you can submit comments to the Climate Council until September 24th. That is coming right up. We will, let's put the links here right in the chat. My computer's not working, but they are accepting comments on the work of the working groups and the work of the council until September 24th. So please go ahead and add your comments if you'd like. Secondly, next slide is there are more meetings coming up. So as the council further refines what the policies might be or what this plan looks like, they are hosting additional public meetings. Thank you to them for doing that. The next meetings are coming up in October, the 1st and the 21st. So that's the 1st from 9 to 12 and the 21st from 9 to 12 in the morning. Registration is open, so feel free to do that. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, vote. We need you folks to vote for a number of reasons. The end result of this climate plan is will likely include various pieces of legislation that will need to pass through the legislature. And in order for that to happen, we need to elect people who are going to help make it happen, whoever that might be. So this page here from the Maine Conservation Alliance can help you with everything you need to know about voting absentee this coming election. And we actually have a poll for folks that can help you to ask whether you are planning to vote absentee, and also some other actions that you could take. So we'd love to hear from you if you're planning on taking any of these actions. That it could include writing a letter to the editor, submitting your comments through the Climate Council portal, registering for the meetings. And also we have another poll about voting absentee coming up. We would love to hear from you. We really encourage you to take action. We know that these comments get right to the Climate Council and they want to hear from folks. So please do that. So as you're voting in these polls, I'm going to move now into your questions. Thank you for bearing with us. We've had a few questions about the public surveys and who they reached. Do we have any sense from the panelists here about whether those surveys were able to reach across party lines, say, or what do we know anything about that? Do we feel confident at all about that? I can say that the surveys did not take personal information, party information or anything like that. And so, questions about do we reach both sides of the aisle? I know that the Climate Council itself is made up of bipartisan members covering lots of different ground in the state from lots of different angles. And so to the extent that those folks represent the views of a variety of Mainers, that's certainly a critical part of the council. I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I would add that certainly the fact that responses came from 74% of Maine zip codes is a good indicator that there were many different types of folks from all over the state that responded. Though certainly, I think I'm of the opinion that no amount of public comment will ever be enough. And I know that this has been a difficult time. We're in a pandemic. It's hard to get folks to respond online. The surveys were also long, and I took a look at them, and they certainly were an endeavor to fill out. So yeah, the surveys, in short, I think are not perfect, and they're definitely not a perfect representation of the types of opinions that are from across the state. But I do think that they give us a really good indication of what policies are going to be favorable and what aren't. And I don't know, David or Kathleen, if you have anything else to add to that question. But yeah, my thought is just that they're not perfect, but they're what we have given the current circumstances, and also that the time for public comment isn't over yet, which is also exciting.
And I think that's right. It's also true that the kind of support that we need is more than just this summer while we're developing the plan, right? We're going to need broad support behind the implementation, which is going to take place over years. So no one should feel like the window has closed on your opportunity to get involved. We will need continuous involvement. It's also worth noting that sometimes what we see in this kind of survey effort is a really concerted opposition effort to go in and say, not a good fit, not a good fit, not a good fit. I don't want to jinx anything, but that's not what we saw.
Great, thank you. Okay, getting into the questions here. This is a good one, I think, for on your right. Is there a plan, this is from Nan in Rockland, is there a plan to engage educators, especially at the high school level, to combine science, economics, health policy, math, writing, critical thinking, et cetera, into curriculum to encourage young people to learn about climate and climate planning?
Yeah, that's a great question. In short, not yet, but that is a great idea and certainly something that has been discussed within folks talking about adding climate education to the Climate Council plan. I think I would add that climate education wasn't a part of the original framework and wasn't discussed in depth within the working groups. And so it's something that is now being added because it's very critical. And so I think this is a good section that folks can submit public comment on if you have ideas or things that would be helpful within education and education practices. Yeah, but I would add that one of the recommendations that is being looked at is providing more training for educators to be able to teach about climate education in schools.
Great. I do see that it's one. I have some confirmation from my panelists and we can continue on. So if you are able to join as an attendee, please do. We're going to keep going. A question from Ken about sort of clarifications about the scope of some of the recommendations, about whether there are recommendations for sort of community level initiatives and policies, or if it's just at the state level. Does someone want to speak to that, sort of how these may be implemented or the scope?
I can take a stab at that. I mean, clearly they should be taken at all levels. Much of what we've talked about in terms of the plan, certainly a lot of it's about state action, state agency action, but much of that action is to help out at the local level, or to obviously result in impacts and programs at the local level, whether that's technical assistance, planning assistance, engineering assistance for adaptation, for instance, preparedness, vulnerability assessments, those kinds of things, where local governments don't have capacity, the state should, and partners, private partners could step in to help out. Some of the larger initiatives obviously are economy-wide initiatives, and that happens in large part at the state level, whether it's through the PU, the Public Utilities Commission, or other things. I don't know if Kathleen wants to say a bit more here.
Yeah, I often said that one of the silver linings of the LePage years was that in the absence of really strong state leadership on climate, Maine communities stepped up. And we saw energy committees and sustainability committees and all sorts of activity at the local level, which meant that when we were ready to have strong state leadership, there were a lot of towns with a lot of ideas, both about the resources that they needed and about the barriers that that we as a state needed to get out of their way. So in the Community Resilience Working Group, there was a lot of conversation about how can we streamline the process, permitting for renewable energy projects, for example. How can we make that easy for towns to undertake? If I know I want to start a new program in my town, where do I go for the resources? That shouldn't take me any time to figure out at all. So our job really as a state is to, as David said, do the things that only the state can do, provide the resources that towns need, and get out of their way.
Great, thank you. A question here for David from Nancy about funding grid improvements. Do you think that Climate Resiliency Bank, Clean Energy Bank money should go to monitoring the grid?
Well, it can go to any number of things, if it's structured broadly. But one of the things it could do, certainly it could support a monitoring system, although again, it depends on the kind of capital and who might want to invest in that, for instance, because we're trying to leverage private capital as well. But the other thing is it could help to establish a public authority of some kind that starts to accrue more public interest assets in the energy system. For instance, more distributed energy generation projects, microgrids, these kinds of things. So again, the bank, conceivably a bank would only be one mechanism, but it could certainly help to support the development of any number of systems, like monitoring, but certainly beyond that. And that's why I think one of the things I'd say also about on the adaptation side, the resilience side, I mean, the amount of money we'll be spending on our working waterfronts to retrofit those waste treatment plants, even road and bridge infrastructure. I mean, these are the kinds of things where an infrastructure component of the bank would really help to generate a lot of capital, conceivably, and jobs. I mean, jobs, a lot of good, high quality construction jobs, high paying construction jobs, those kinds of things.
Thanks. A question from Kathleen, different Kathleen, about climate justice issues. Could someone talk about how, so the question is, any specific focus on climate justice issues? Could someone touch on what's going on there?
Sure, I can take that. Thanks for the question, Kathleen. There is an equity analysis being done that will be coming out within the coming week or so. That's going to look at how the proposed working group strategies affect different people differently and affect equity. And so definitely that's a focus. It's in statute that we have to look at equity. And so that's certainly a lever to promote climate justice solutions. Also, personally, as a council member, it's something that I'm especially interested in and especially pushing for within the final draft strategies. So yeah, I appreciate that question. Definitely something that is really important as we move forward in order to create a just and livable future for all people in Maine. So thanks.
Agreed. Thanks, Anya. Question from Scott. The food system, so role of agriculture in the climate crisis. The food system, he says, is often deemed responsible for 1/3 of overall emissions. It's deeply threatened by heat, drought, etc. Do we foresee more attention on local regenerative agriculture as we move forward? Or are there other general questions about the food safety piece of this?
I can, let me just jump in there. The short answer is absolutely. And if you look at an area where we can really absorb a lot of carbon, it's healthy soils. I mean, healthiest soils really are carbon-rich soils. And regenerative ag is agriculture that really, you get more pasture, you get more turnover, you get more cover crops, those kinds of things that help to really bring carbon into the soil itself. And as buy local, as Mainers buy more local produce, that's certainly going to be great for our agricultural sector. Over 90% of the food we eat comes in from out of state. A more reliable, sustainable agricultural system or food system is one where Mainers grow more food and grow food in ways where they, quite frankly, might start to get credit from carbon sequestration as a benefit as well. And so I hope that if others want to add in here, that'd be great.
Great, thanks, David. I see 3 minutes left. I'm gonna shut it down, I think at 1:10, just so we can all get some lunch or move on. A question from Joe. Any reactions to how GoPIF has incorporated the natural and working lands strategies into our framework?
Yeah, I'll take that. Thanks, Nick. Yeah, in short, definitely some more that needs to be added to the natural and working land strategy. And David was just touching on a few of those things. And I think one of those things that needs to be added is creating a dedicated, sustained public funding source that generates at least $15 million annually to conserve working forest, ag, and ecologically significant lands in order to work on some of those funding mechanisms that David has talked about. And then I would also add too, just to kind of piggyback on what David was talking about with the last question, I think definitely a need to look into food security within the state. 90% of Maine's food comes from out of state, and as the climate changes and where we're able to get our food from changes, and also looking at the carbon footprint of our food, that is a big piece that I think needs to get added to the Climate Council recommendations. So yeah, thanks for that question.
Great, thanks, Anya. So I see 109, so that leaves me just 1 minute to sort of wrap up here. And I'm gonna sort of jump off a question that Medea just asked, which is in a similar vein to some other questions about ensuring bipartisanship, ensuring wide buy-in in Maine about this. That's critical to this piece, not just in forming the plan, but also in trying to pass the plan or pieces of the plan. That's where, you know, we really need your help. The organizations on this call are ones that try to, you know, use our voice as loudly as we can to get all Mainers aware of and participating in this process. But, you know, as attendees, this is where you can help out a lot. Join our events, share your opinions on Facebook and social media and in the newspaper and on the street corner, wherever you want. It takes all of us to sort of help ensure that everyone is aware of what's going on and how important it is and how exciting this is. So that's where we'll turn to next on our second half or second few innings or whatever the end of the next part of this is going to look like. So
Game two, as Kathleen said.
Game two, sure. I want to thank all the attendees on today for joining. I want to thank my panelists, Kathleen, David, Anya, and Anya. I want to thank NRCM, the Natural Resources Council of Maine, for hosting us today, Todd. And thank you so much. If there are questions we didn't get to, I apologize. We're just crushed on time. You can send them to me. I'm going to dare to put my my email in the chat here, nlund@maineaudubon.org. Let me know what you think. We will get a recording up as soon as we can and share that with you. Thank you to everyone, and I hope everyone has a great afternoon.
Thanks, Nick. You've done a great job.